I do have a face. My name is Susie Kaiser, and I'll be the moderator tonight. I live in Cleveland Heights. I'm a member of the Cleveland Heights chapter, and I'm the League of Women Voters Education Specialist on the State Lobby Corps. This is the first of a two-part series on equity and anti-racism in Ohio schools. We are really fortunate to have members of the Ohio Board of Education who crafted the state's anti-racism position. Captioning is available for this event. If you look in the far right side of the bottom of your computer screen, there's a little CC live transcript. Just click on that and you can have, that will be available. Please keep your screens muted and feel free to add questions to the chat as we go. Much like the civil rights, the Real Talk is a project of 4 leagues, the Akron, Kent, Hudson, and Greater Cleveland. Their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee has organized this event. Much like the civil rights movement of the 1960s that put in plain sight the terrible indignities and injustices of institutional racism and set into motion a wide swath of efforts to advance civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement has shined a light on the unfinished work of rooting out racism. The League, like institutions and organizations and individuals across our country, is responding. Tonight's program is one step in our efforts to fully honor and embrace, understand, and make more real equity and inclusion and value diversity. Over the next year, Real Talk will bring the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion to a variety of issues. So tonight's is public education, which is a personal interest of mine. I've spent most of the last 40 years as a public school advocate working to advance the citizen's role in making schools successful at the local and state level. Public schools are worth the fight. 2 years ago, I joined the State League as their education specialist, and I've worked with many of you across the state advocating for better state policies for our public schools. And I look forward to doing that with all of you in the year ahead. Because an educated citizenry is so important to a functioning democracy, our state constitution and every state constitution requires that the legislature provide for a system of common schools, paid for with public funds, free and open to all. The founding fathers believed that equal access to high quality education was way too important to our society to be left to individuals to pay for. That is why we have a publicly funded and operated system. This is a profound commitment to the equal value of every child, every resident, and every voter in the state. But like so many of our promises, achieving full equality and inclusion remain a work in progress. So at this point, we're going to view a short video that will help frame the work of the panel. It will explore and give us a common language for tackling the issues that the State Board of Education resolution tries to address. Yeah.
Funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors.
Can we start it over, please?
Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with Black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
If you need to rewatch that, Michael has included the link so you can watch it again. I'd like the final message, which is everybody has a way to work on it. And we're really grateful tonight that to look at how our State Board of Education has chosen to take on.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has
In July of 2020, with leadership provided by tonight's speakers, the Ohio State Board of Education passed a resolution that committed the board and the State Department of Education that it oversees to examine racism in these public entities and how to more effectively advance racial equality. Tonight's panelists are the architects of that resolution. They bring a wealth of experience to their service on the state board and to this issue. Each will make a short presentation about the who, what, where, and why of this resolution. It has been a really great pleasure to get to know them a little better as we've prepared for tonight's conversation. And we are really fortunate that we have their leadership on the state board. Our first presenter is Board President Laura Kohler, who was first appointed to the board in February of 2017 and then was elected president in 2019, a position she still holds. She brings the local school district perspective to the task. She served multiple terms on the Board of Education for Worthington and in her current community, New Albany. She's a graduate of Duke University and holds an MBA from the University of Dayton. She's a real estate agent. Our second presenter will be Linda Haycock. Linda just completed her term representing District 1 on the far west side of the state. She lives in Lima, where she spent 8 years on her local school Board of Education. Before running for the state board, she served on the Ohio School Boards Association cabinet and met frequently with state policymakers. She's a native of Minneapolis and a graduate of Brigham Young University. Third, we'll have Merrill Johnson, who was just elected to a second term representing District 11, which means she represents most of us in Northeast Ohio. She brings the perspective and passion from her 40-year career as a public school teacher in Cleveland, union leader and teacher educator. Like her colleagues, the education of all children has been the focus of her work inside and outside the classroom. Merrill is a graduate of Kent State University and holds a Master of Education from Cleveland State University. Stephanie Dodd is our final presenter. She just completed her second term on the state board representing District 9, which includes Licking County. She operates a consulting firm, and her career has also included a stint doing government relations for a number of corporations. A former candidate for lieutenant governor, she lives in Buckeye Lake and is a graduate of the University of Cincinnati. So at this point, our panel will take over. So our board president, Laura Kohler, will be the beginning speaker.
Thank you so much for setting us up for success here this evening, Susie. And before I'd start, I would like to thank you on behalf of my colleagues, thank the League of Women Voters of the Hudson, Akron, Canton, and Greater Cleveland area, Cynthia Peoples and the Real Talk team, and of course our moderator, Susie Kaiser. Thanks so much. We are thrilled to be with you this evening and reviewing our work on this very important resolution. First, a little bit of background, I think, on the State Board of Education. We were actually authorized in Article 6 of Ohio's Constitution and given specific authority to appoint the state superintendent of public instruction and also powers and duties that are prescribed by law. We are not a lawmaking body, and I think that's probably fairly obvious to all of you folks. Our job, rather, is to write and review the rules that operationalize the law. We also deal with territory transfers and professional discipline. Ohio is what's called a local control state. And what that means is that the policymakers have determined that many decisions, including curriculum, are best made at the local level, where the board and the superintendent are most familiar with the unique needs of their district. And that does play into our resolution when we get ready to talk about what is going to happen next. The board itself is a little bit unusual compared to most other state boards of education. It's comprised of 19 members, and it's a combination of members who are elected to represent specific districts. There are 11 of those members, and you see the most current list on your screen right now. The governor can appoint 8 members, and they are called at-large members. So you'll see the 6 at-large members, and I am an at-large member myself. We serve 4-year terms, and we can serve 2 consecutive terms before we need to leave the board. So with the last election, District 1, which was represented by Linda, who you'll hear from, is the current representative is now Diana Fessler, and in District 9, which was previously represented by Stephanie Dodd, is now represented by Michelle Newman. We serve, as you can see on the little map there to the left, about 1.7 million Ohio students. And there are roughly, if the number changes somewhat, around 613 school districts. And we are serving those districts as well as community schools in the state of Ohio. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I'd like to share just a little snapshot of Ohio students. You'll see that on the left. 30.3% are non-white, and of those, 16.8% are Black, non-Hispanic. We will refer to the teacher data a little bit later, but I would like you to note that although over 30% of Ohio students are non-white, currently over 5.5% of the teachers are identified as non-white. So 92% of Ohio's current teachers identify as white, non-Hispanic. The third slide, if we can switch, please, is you're seeing a screenshot at the beginning of the resolution that the board adopted. It's the resolution to condemn racism and to advance equity and opportunity for Black students, Indigenous students, and students of color. The resolution, it's important to note, did not pass without dissent, but a significant majority of board members are committed to the work and its demands. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you the why, the how, and the what. And at the end of the presentation, I will circle back to explain to you what we believe will happen next. So first, the why. And this is a bit of a personal story, and I'm sure we all have personal stories about this, but late spring of 2020 was a very difficult time for our country. The horror of the death of George Floyd had many of us questioning our own culpability in the tragedy and feeling our own imperative to contribute to a solution. We recognize that each of us has our own sphere of influence. It just so happened that for Merle, Stephanie, Linda, and myself, our sphere intersects in the pre-K-12 education world, and that's where we decided to act. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is to provide you just simply some data that was compiled by the Department of Education here that just shows you some statistics and why this has become such an imperative for us. The state has been tracking graduation rates for many years, and the results have been somewhat stable. The data that you see in front of you right now is from the class of 2019, which is the most recent data we had available. I'd like you to look at the red bar first. That bar represents the average of all Ohio students. And what that is telling you is that 85.9%, almost 86% of all Ohio seniors graduated. If you move over and take a look at the green bar, that represents Black non-Hispanic students. That number is 75%, which represents almost an 11% difference. I'd like you to also, if you can see it, take a look at the bar for economically disadvantaged students. I should also tell you that there's overlap. You can be in more than one of these categories, but 76.5% of economically disadvantaged students graduated on time, which is a number that is less than the state average, but it is a higher percentage than that for students who identify as Black. In fact, the only groups with a lower graduation rate are those students who are involved with ELL or English language learners, the homeless, migrant children, children involved in foster care, and adjudicated youth. And all of those students then are dealing with instability and often with poverty. If we could move on to the next slide, please. We've looked at some high school data. Now let's see some data that reflects our younger students. This data reflects the percentage of Ohio students who have met the requirements of the third grade reading guarantee, either by scoring proficient on the state tests, scoring high enough on another accepted assessment, or by qualifying for an exemption. You can see that almost 95.1% of Ohio third graders were promoted in the 2018-19 school year. However, Black non-Hispanic students were promoted at a rate of 87.5%, or 7.5% lower than the average. The lowest rate of any of these subgroups, including children with disabilities and those who are economically disadvantaged, are those who identify as Black. The next slide, please. The last slide was a little bit hard to see, so this one is simplified just to demonstrate that for the average of all students, and they're listed there as female and male, compared to the average for Black students. And there are two takeaways in the slide. The first is that the performance gap has persisted over at least the last 4 years. But there is some hopeful news, and that is that the gap does seem to be getting smaller. However, no one would argue that these results are acceptable. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is a specific definition with specific criteria, and it does not represent a child who has a cough and stays at home from time to time. We're talking here about persistent, unexcused absences. I'd like you to disregard the 2020 data. I'm honestly not quite sure what to make of that data because it doesn't track with the other, and I'm wondering and have not had an opportunity to really study if that data is impacted and skewed by the pandemic. So I'd like to invite you instead to look at the data from 2014 on the far right side to 2019. In 2019, the chronic absenteeism rate for all students was 17.2%. For Black students, 31.6%, a significant 14.4% point gap. If you look over time, you'll see a similar pattern with a concerning twist. From 2014 through 17, both the percentage of students experiencing chronic absenteeism and the gap between the average for all students and Black students were relatively stable. However, for the two most recent years prior to 2020, the gap has widened from just under 11 points to 14 percentage points. In addition, chronic absenteeism for Black students jumped significantly in 2008 from a rate of 27.8% to 30% in 2018. And 31.6% in 2019. One has to ask oneself, why is this happening? Next slide, please. This graph, this shows you similar information just in graphic form. And again, what I'm trying to show you here is that the chronic absenteeism rate for all students is red, and that for Black non-Hispanic students is the green line. And I would just like you to note the persistent gap between those two rates. Next slide, please. Finally, to begin to try and answer the why, let's take a look at the demographic information about Ohio's teachers from 2005-06 to 2018-19. And I apologize that the numbers are small. There's a lot of information on that slide, and I'm moving pretty quickly here. But here are a couple of key takeaways. First, in no way does the demographic breakdown of Ohio's teachers reflect the diverse demographics of the students in the state. 91.7% of teachers, of Ohio's teachers, identify as white, non-Hispanic, and 4.4% as Black or African American. And as a reminder, 69.7% of students are white and almost 17% are Black. The second takeaway is that the percentage of teachers who identify as Black or African American has actually dropped since 2005, 2006, when over 5% identified as Black or African American. Another concerning piece of data. Slide 10, please, or the next slide, I'm sorry. Thanks so much. Now, I've shared with you some of the data that explains the why this is so important that we work to advance equity and opportunity for Black students and other students of color. Now, I want to share the how and the what. I will tell you that I introduced a resolution to the board in June, I believe, that had to do with equity, but honestly, it was not a very good resolution. It was, I would describe it as a milquetoast attempt to deal with a huge issue and problem. And honestly, my resolution was not well received. So I asked others who were interested in this to contact me. And almost immediately, Merle, Stephanie, and Linda reached out to me, and we began to work together on it. So the process was, we knew it had to be grounded in our strategic plan. Ohio has a wonderful 5-year plan called Each Child Our Future, and I believe that there'll be a link to that in your chat box. I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. And that absolutely centered our work. The second step was that we knew we had to know the data. I was aware of these gaps, but when you see them all lined up like this, it really forces, it gives you the motivation or the imperative to do something different than what we've been doing before. In no way am I attempting to condemn or to belittle or to denigrate the work that's been done in the past by very caring and expert teachers and other members of the education community who care deeply about this issue. I have no doubt that people who are talented and resolute have been working on this problem, but we're not moving the needle. So the next thing that the 4 of us did was we took a look at what other public bodies were doing about equity. And we looked at a number of resources, including the Durham, North Carolina Public Schools equity statement, and they had reacted to the tragedy in Charlottesville. We looked at Arlington, Virginia. We also looked at one from the American Federation of Teachers, the Seattle Education Association, and multiple others. But maybe the most important thing we did was we talked to each other. We had honest, courageous, and very vulnerable conversations. We recognized that early on that we are each in a different point in our journey. I was the novice of the group. In fact, I had to ask Merle and Stephanie to define the term white privilege for me. It was a term I had never heard before. But you know what happened? None of them held their hands up in horror. I was not judged. What I found instead was just a complete willingness to help me learn as much as I was willing to learn. And I share this story with you because I think that for us to be able to work together to advance equity and deal with these very complex issues, we are going to have to be willing to be vulnerable, to confess that we don't know all the answers, and to lean on each other and trust each other as we work things through. The next slide, please. I'm going to conclude here by sharing kind of the highlights from this equity resolution, of which I think that we are most proud. First of all, the equity resolution is data-driven, and it's based on a commitment to equity that was already defined in the state's strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future. Equity is spelled out in that document as one of our 3 core principles, and I'll quote, Ohio's greatest education challenge remains equity in education achievement for each child. The path to equity begins with a deep understanding of the history of discrimination and bias and how it has come to impact current society. The second thing I think that we are most proud of is that it is a very strong statement of the condemnation of racism and violence. In the equity resolution, you'll find these words: the State Board of Education condemns in the strongest possible terms white supremacy culture, hate speech, hate crimes, and violence in the service of hatred. These immoral ideologies and actions deserve no place in our country, state, and school system. And the third piece, of which we are exceedingly proud, is that it really contains a call to action. We'll circle back and talk about this at the end of this evening's presentation, but I can assure you that no one wanted a resolution that was long on platitudes, but without teeth or accountability. And I think that we were able to deliver that in the resolution. So at this point, I will thank you for your attention and apologize for the data dump and turn things over to Linda Haycock, former board member, District 1. Linda.
Thank you, Laura. I want to thank the Ohio League of Women Voters for this opportunity to be with you tonight and with my former colleagues. And to have this conversation concerning the Ohio State Board of Education Resolution 20 on equity, systemic racism, and white privilege passed July 14th, 2020. As my term on the Ohio State Board of Education ended December 31st, 2020, I've had a chance to reflect on all that took place during my 4-year term. I rank Resolution 20 as the most important work to which I contributed. The issues addressed in the resolution are foundational to all other aspects of the work at the Ohio Department of Education. The impact on students and educators throughout the state and society as a whole are immeasurable. We do have some indicators that show small portions of the impact, as President Kohler has shared with us. What's more, I believe that the resolution embodies core American values of fairness, self-improvement, moral leadership, and e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Before I go on into the Resolution 20, I wanted to take some time and share why I care about this. In 1991, my husband and I and our 2 small children, a 3-year-old son and a 3-month-old son, moved to California so my husband could begin medical school. Although I had just graduated from college with a degree in economics, and knowing that my husband's medical training would at least take 4 years, I desired to stay home with our 2 small children. We would have access to student loans to live off of, but to minimize the debt, I secured work as a manager at a small property of 31 apartments, where we would live for the next 4 to 7 years. I knew my 3-year-old son would attend kindergarten and 1st grade there, possibly longer. In the first few weeks of moving in, I began to think about the actual school my son would attend. These apartments were in a neighborhood on the proverbial other side of the tracks, with higher crime rates and a larger population of poorer people of color. I assumed that the schools would be poorly funded with vast needs. I found this assumption was sadly reality. I had no intention of my son attending the neighborhood school and immediately began looking into the school options for him. I learned where the school district administrative offices were, and I started calling to find out what options I had. I learned that the school district allowed for open enrollment within the school district. There was another elementary school across town, 3 miles from the apartments, that was classified as a national blue ribbon school. So I put my son's name on the waiting list, a full 2 years before he would enter kindergarten. I was fortunate to know that we would be living at the same address when the time came that he might or may not be accepted into the school. I also knew that we would eventually move. I didn't need a long-run solution. At the time, my husband and I had 1 car. I had access to it 4 days a week. The other day, I would have to use public transportation to deliver and pick up my son from school. This routine of 2 round trips back and forth to school took me 4 hours to complete. I had 4 hours available for the 2 round trips once a week. I could not have done it every day. No one could do it every day. I knew how to speak the language. I was a 2nd-generation college-educated woman. I knew how to solve the problems in the system, and I knew how to find the answers. 2 years later, we found out 1 week before my son started kindergarten that he was accepted into the blue ribbon school across town. I was grateful. But back at our apartment complex, as the manager, I got to know all the residents on a personal level. I got to know their work schedules, often inconsistent and ill-paid. I got to know their family situations. Many had multiple generations living in an apartment. I knew what cars they drove, or if they had to take the bus every day while their kids walked to school. I would inspect their apartments and see their furnishings. I knew if they spoke English, and I knew their country of origin. Up until this point in my life, I had never lived in a neighborhood where I was the minority. But in this neighborhood, I was definitely the minority. I saw firsthand many of the barriers that my neighbors had, ones that I didn't have. For the first time, I saw the lives of the people of color and people who lived in poverty. It was a turning point for me. I started seeing the benefit I had and they didn't. I still ponder whether we did what was best for those kids that played with my kids. I wonder to this day, where are they? Did they reach their God-given potential, or were they never given the opportunity? It broke my heart to see the loss of human potential. I firmly believe that it is in the best interest of America, economically, socially, and morally, to give everyone the opportunity to rise to their God-given potential. If we don't, we have not lived up to our potential as a nation where we pledge to seek the general welfare and treat everyone as equal. This is why I care about Resolution 20. Within the resolution, the State Board resolved to, in the strongest possible terms, condemn white supremacy culture, hate speech, hate crimes, and violence in the service of hatred. The resolution further indicates that a starting point of our work and racial equity must be a reflection and an internal examination, whereby the board will look for ways to engage our members in open and courageous conversations on racism and inequity. I think it's important to repeat that the resolution called for open and courageous internal examination of the board, the Department of Education, and those who contract with the Ohio Department of Education, and most importantly, an inward self-evaluation. While we are all on our individual journeys of awareness of white supremacy culture and white privilege, I'll admit it has taken me some time to learn this new vocabulary. What's more, definitions of some terms have evolved. It might be advantageous for me to take a few minutes to briefly define each. White supremacy culture. A few board members expressed concerns that the words white supremacy culture were too politically charged. It is true that white supremacy has historically been used only to define overt, vocal, and unabashed white supremacist groups like the KKK. People and groups who preach the superiority of lighter-skinned, primarily Northern European people. It referred to personal beliefs and actions. However, white supremacy is often now used in a broader sense as a cultural pattern. White supremacy culture is the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. It's important to realize that Americans of European descent started calling themselves white only to contrast themselves with people of African, Native American, and Asian descent. Later immigrants wanting to avoid persecution directed at people of color often aspired to become white and sometimes succeeded. Whiteness isn't a culture or a heritage. It's a category that was designed to be exclusionary. We might not even realize the effect that this culture has had on us until we associate more closely with people of color. And this effect shows up in all sorts of places. For instance, African-American music styles were foundational to rock and roll, but didn't get a more popular audience and even were denounced until white artists adopted those styles, often without crediting or paying their Black originators. If we believe in the fundamental American proposition that all people are created equal, we should question ideas that hinder that goal, ideas of whiteness. We should work together to root out white supremacy culture throughout our society and instead learn about and celebrate the indispensable contributions of all Americans, including in our education system. White privilege. In academic studies, it's common to speak of holding all else equal so we can test a single variable. Holding all other variables, I, as a white person, have benefited at some level more than my fellow citizens of color, solely by virtue of the color of my skin and my parents' skin. This is white privilege. White privilege exists as a legacy of historic and enduring biases, practices, and even overt racism that were created, designed, and adopted to marginalize and disadvantage people of color. As white people, we have benefited merely by birth and appearance from this historic difference in treatment. Talking about white privilege can feel uncomfortable to white people for several reasons. We as white people are not used to being identified, described, or defined by our race. It can feel like an accusation of racism instead of what it actually is, a mere description of a phenomenon that we're unconsciously experienced. White privilege is enjoyed by decent, honest, well-intended white people. The term white privilege just doesn't sound applicable to poor or rural white people who certainly face unique sets of challenges. We're used to associating the word privilege only with being wealthy. The words white privilege also seem to imply that white people never struggle, which is not true. White people struggle, but not because of the color of their skin, in contrast to non-white people. Unless we regularly associate with people of color, we may never hear about the differences in treatment that they only experience. Implicit bias. Thoughts and feelings are implicit if we are unaware of them, mistaken about their nature. When we have bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or an aversion to a person or group of people. Thus, we can use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. Understanding implicit bias is so important because that most of our actions occur without conscious thought, allowing us to function in an extraordinarily complex world. This means, however, that our implicit biases often predict how we'll behave more accurately than our conscious values. Some examples of how individual biases influence our behavior are the criminal justice and medical systems. Multiple studies have found that with higher implicit biases levels against Black people are more likely to categorize or see non-weapons as weapons, such as mistaking a phone for a gun or a comb for a knife. Similarly, white physicians who implicitly associate Black patients with being less cooperative were less likely to refer Black patients with acute coronary symptoms for thrombosis for specific medical care. Looking back at when I moved to the neighborhood in California, I have realized that I associated higher crime rates with a proportion of the people of color. That was implicit bias in me. Since then, I have learned that higher crime rates are more correlated with poverty than with ethnicity. But people of color have been kept poor through racially discriminatory systems. The education system, the Ohio State Board of Education members, and those who work with the Ohio Department of Education all suffer from implicit biases to some degree. So we included implicit bias training for all these people to help prevent the harmful effects of implicit bias. Redlining. I wanted to explain one way that white supremacy culture, white privilege, and implicit biases have greatly impacted the foundation of the education system in Ohio and throughout the country. Back in the 1930s, several federal agencies were tasked with creating maps to judge the security for real estate investments in various neighborhoods. Appraisers were instructed to mark neighborhoods of, quote, inharmonious racial groups as high risk, outlining them in red on maps. Zoning ordinances with similar effects were also common. As a result of this redlining, Black homeowners found it difficult to acquire mortgages to purchase new homes, which made it virtually impossible to build real estate equity. Housing equity is a major element of inheritable wealth in America, so the lack of access meant that Black parents had less to bequeath to their children, exacerbating the racial wealth gap. What's more, since local schools are often funded by property taxes, redlining had a secondary effect of starving majority minority schools of funding needed for adequate programs. I had never heard of the word redlining and did not even know the laws existed until far into my adulthood. However, I have benefited from the system of redlining. My parents and I could purchase decent homes in neighborhoods serviced by decent schools. For an example, in my own home township, until probably 1968, a covenant governing the disposition of some land and housing stipulated, quote, the premises herein conveyed shall not be sold, conveyed, or assigned to anyone of African or Mongolian descent, unquote. If you want to read more about redlining, I recommend Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. I am grateful for the creation and passage of Resolution 20 and look forward to having more constructive and transformational discussions like this. We need real improvements in our communities and society to root out the white supremacy culture that has thwarted American ideals for centuries. I urge everyone in the state to humbly take a look inward, learn how white supremacist culture in the United States has influenced our history, and reflect on how this culture continues to impact how we treat one another individually and broadly. It's now my pleasure to turn the time over to Ohio State Board of Education member Merle Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for approaching us about doing these very important forums. How do we begin to dismantle generations of racism? By identifying policies that result in inequitable outcomes. Now, this is a line that I decided to focus on from our resolution. Whereas starting as early as preschool, Black male students are affected disproportionately by suspension, expulsions, and zero-tolerance discipline policies in schools. I was sitting in the audience as a student at Glenville High School when Dr. Martin Luther King said the following, quote, "In order to be truly free, we have to develop within ourselves a deep sense of somebodyness. Don't let anybody make you feel that you are nobody, because the minute one feels that way, he becomes incapable of rising to his full maturity as a person," end quote. The decisions that teachers sometimes make can affect a child's sense of somebodyness, and that in turn can affect a Black child's life. Will success be in their future, or will they enter the school to prison pipeline? It is expected that 1 in 3 Black males will go to jail in his lifetime. And it can start with a suspension or expulsion as early as preschool. Discipline should be positive, helping to promote a child's social emotional development and ability to self-regulate. Everyone else has been giving definitions. 3 quick definitions: suspension, temporary removal from the classroom or school as a response to what has been interpreted as problem behavior. Expulsion, permanent dismissal from school or a program as a response to what has been interpreted as problem behavior. Zero tolerance, enforcement of rules, even when infractions are done in ignorance, by accident, or under extenuating circumstances. Our strategic plan, Each Child Our Future, is built around the essential concept of equity. Equity means that every child has the necessary experiences and resources for success. We focus on a whole child model, which means that every child is safe, healthy, engaged in learning and the community, supported, and challenged academically. Every day, institutional racism and implicit bias make success harder to reach for our Black youth. Let me begin with some national data. If you look at the slide that's been posted, it's from the United States Education Department Civil Rights Data Collection Survey from 2013-2014, covering more than 95,000 schools and 50 million students. First, 51% of high schools with high Black and Latino enrollment also have assigned police officers. Next, although Black students make up 16% of student enrollment, they represent 27% of students referred to law enforcement and 31% of students subjected to a school-related arrest. Next, 1.6 million students attend a high school with a police officer but no guidance counselor. And next, Black students are 2.3 times more likely than white students to be referred to law enforcement or arrested as a result of a school incident. Now let's look at some Ohio data. Next slide, please. I think you posted it before. It was a slide before that. That's it. Thank you. During the 2019-2020 school year, 3,239 white students were suspended or expelled, compared to 7,999 Black students. Also, for some national data, Black preschoolers are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended than white preschoolers, and Black high schoolers are twice as likely to be suspended than white. Now, why do these disparities exist? In a 2002 study, you can remove the slide, thank you. In a 2002 study, Dr. Walter Gilliam, director of the Edward Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy at Yale University, conducted a study of about 4,000 preschool classrooms across the country. Among the questions asked was, over the past 12 months, have you ever required a child to permanently terminate participation in your program because of a challenging behavior? Now, the study had an 81% response rate, and it found that 10% of all teachers reported having permanently expelled at least one child in the past year because of challenging behaviors. Dr. Gilliam and his staff called the US Department of Education data to compare and found the rate, and this is a really important sentence, they found the rate of expulsion in these pre-kindergarten programs serving children 3 and 4 years old was 2 times higher than for students in grades K to 12. In 2005, Dr. Gilliam decided that he would continue his research to find out why these students were being expelled and who they were. He found that pre-K teachers, white and Black alike, spend more time watching Black boys expecting trouble due to implicit bias. He realized that even the most well-meaning teachers can hold deep-seated biases, whether they know it or not. So Dr. Gilliam and his team decided to try an experiment. At a big annual conference for pre-K teachers, Dr. Gilliam and his team selected 135 educators to watch a few short videos. Now, here are the instructions. Now, the instructions are very important. So here's what they told those pre-K teachers. We are interested in learning about how teachers detect challenging behavior in the classroom. Sometimes this involves seeing behavior before it becomes problematic. The video segments you are about to view are of preschoolers engaging in various activities. Some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. Your job is to press the enter key on the external keypad every time you see a behavior that could become a potential challenge. Okay, so in the video, there was a Black boy and girl and there was a white boy and girl. Now here's the secret. There was no challenging behavior. While the teachers watched, eye scan technology measured the trajectory of their gaze. Dr. Gilliam would want to know when teachers expected bad behavior, whom did they watch? And just to tell you, I actually got to see Dr. Gilliam present this information. And it turned out that the teachers looked more at the Black children than the white children. And they looked specifically more at the Black boy. And to look up at the video during Dr. Gilliam's presentation and to see all of these red dots, which represented the gazes from the eyes of the teachers, to see all these red dots on that Black boy was heartbreaking. And it chokes me up just to think about it. Dr. Gilliam's conclusion, preschool expulsion is not a challenging behavior problem, it's an adult decision problem. And it's not just preschool. In a report called Start with Equity, From the Early Years to the Elementary Grades, an analysis of pre-K through elementary school systems was done. States reported 1.27 million cases of young children enrolled in public school being disciplined through exclusionary practices as suspension and expulsion in the 2015-16 school year. A national parents survey found that 50,000 children under 5 were suspended and 17,000 were expelled in a single year. The report also made clear, and this is very important what I'm about to say. Well, the whole thing's important. This is especially important. There is no evidence that Black children show greater or more severe misbehavior. Instead, research suggests Black children are punished more severely than their peers for the same or similar behaviors. On that topic, Kelly Capitosto, a senior research associate at Ohio State University's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, said the following: I think that's been one of the most pervasive and harmful myths about school discipline. We can see through data. It's not the behaviors themselves, but how teachers perceive these behaviors. That's the end of her quote. And then Derek Darby from the University of Michigan said the explanation that Black students misbehave more than white students is, quote, fraudulent, end quote. He also said, if you're saying the kids are inherently bad, then you're sort of proving the point that you're operating with these long-standing racist assumptions. Bettina Love, author of the book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit for Educational Freedom, calls this spirit murdering. Now, those assumptions can do lasting damage to Black students. Research has shown that students who experience exclusionary discipline are more likely to repeat a grade, drop out of school, and become involved in the juvenile justice system. In the book, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, we learn punitive discipline policies also overwhelmingly target Black girls. These policies not only affect their adult lives, but the lives of their sons and daughters who are more susceptible to being involved in the judicial system if their mom is incarcerated. That also leads to decreased earning possibilities and added costs to our society through mass incarceration and lost tax revenue. While I was researching this topic, I ran across a project called Life Cycles on Inequity, a color-line series on Black men from 2014. The focus for this particular month was implicit bias. A video involved 8 Black high school boys discussing implicit bias. I'm going to try to read this without crying. Linda, almost might join you, because my heart broke as I listened to their reality as these boys made these statements. Here's what the first young man said. I remember back in the first grade, a white girl was crying and the teacher called me over. The girl told her I pushed her down and made her cry. I told the teacher I didn't because I actually hadn't done it. I kept on saying it wasn't me. The teacher took her word for it. That was one of the things at such a young age that made me go, wow, why? The next young man said, no matter how many Louis Armstrongs there are, no matter how many James Baldwins there are, we're always going to be looked at different. Always, just because of our skin color. At the end of the day, we're always going to be shackled up into that category. That's just how it is. The next young man, my teachers would grade me differently, a little easier based on the color of my skin than my white counterparts. I felt that as a teacher, they had internalized the belief that because I'm Black, their expectation of the work I could do was less than other students. And this is the last, there were 8 boys, but I'm only doing 4 quotes. This is the last quote. I wish we could do things like paint, do swimming, do golf, do filmmaking, do acting, do all these things and not be looked at as more white. Football and basketball should not be the limits of self-expression for us. We should feel like we can do more without being judged and put in boxes. 80% of teachers in the country are white. Dr. Eve Ewing, author of Ghost in the Schoolyards, Racism in School Closings on Chicago's South Side, recently said in a Zoom forum, quote, if you are a white teacher and you are not comfortable talking about race and racism, you need to get your act together now because our students need you. And that's the end of her quote. Because as we all know, implicit bias is about race. It shows up in a teacher's decision to refer a student to the office. It shows up in the voice, tone, and body language when a teacher gives feedback on a student's work. It shows up when a college counselor told Michelle Obama she wasn't Princeton material. So what can teachers do? Implicit bias training can help lessen racial disparities in a school district and help address the many inequities that exist as teachers better understand their own reactions towards students and the effect these biases have on them. Now, we all have biases that may affect how we relate to our students. In a high school, a Black principal was told by his students that he focused on Black hall walkers more than white hall walkers when sending students to class. Through self-monitoring, he started noticing his behavior and he changed it. But that's not enough. I started out discussing the devastating amount of suspensions and expulsions our little ones are experiencing. In Ohio, 1 in 4 children live in poverty. 1 in 4. 1 in 3 Appalachian children, and more than 1 in 2 African-American children. Poverty is stressful. Racial trauma exacerbates the stress because students are faced with it outside of school and in school, which should be a safe place. Think about the preschool babies. The first years are the most important. 80% of brain growth happens by age 3. Trauma can literally alter the brain structure by causing the fear center or the amygdala. I love that word, amygdala. You should say that. It's really fun to say. Causes the amygdala to become overactivated and cause the thinking part of the brain to become underactivated. These students have a hard time feeling safe, which is why it's so important for schools to become trauma sensitive. And the example I always give is if you're being chased by a bear, you're not going to really care what 2 + 2 is. So when students are in a panic mode, always afraid, always feeling unsafe, they cannot, take care of the test prep and all that. They just can't do that right then. They have difficulty with self-regulation and focusing on new information because that is controlled by the underactivated thinking brain. This means that every member of the school community should be trained in trauma-informed strategies, not just teachers. Cafeteria workers, secretaries, custodians, bus drivers, everybody should be on the same page for the sake of the children. Our strategic plan's whole child framework is the perfect guide for developing a trauma-sensitive school. Now, how can districts become trauma sensitive? Through alternative suspension, by implementing restorative practices instead of punitive zero tolerance policies, which says everybody's bad, everybody gets the same punishment. This approach, restorative practices, focus on healing the harm done to relationships and people through mediation and/or self-reflection, and welcomes all students back into the classroom community. Also, remind the adults who take care of themselves. Traumatized adults cannot care for traumatized students. So we have staff development and implicit bias and trauma-informed strategies as ways to help all students to succeed. Lastly, I cannot finish without talking about the importance of anti-racist teaching. This means being culturally responsive to the needs of the students, especially Black students. Culturally responsive teachers authentically care and develop trusting relationships with all their students. Systemic racism has been around for 100 years, and culturally responsive teachers are willing and able to fight it. Black students need culturally responsive teachers because everything around them tells them they're not enough. It all begins with teachers doing internal audits to identify any implicit biases or other issues that may affect their ability to relate honestly and compassionately with their students. Teachers need to remind themselves that they are the stranger in the classroom, entering their students' lives and their students' worlds. So they need to learn about that world in order to incorporate the students' lives into the classroom. The results of that audit will directly impact how teachers relate to the families, how they choose curriculum, how they plan lessons, and assess learning. Culturally responsive teachers are not afraid to talk about these tough issues while empowering students to use their voices and to recognize the power they have to be politically and socially conscious in school and out of school. These teachers focus on building students' independent learning power and critical thinking skills, and they give their students space to make mistakes. Finishing up, some states have addressed the problem of suspension and expulsions by passing laws. Ohio, through former Senator Peggy Lehner, who I called the other day just to make sure I had the information correct. Ohio began ending suspensions and expulsions for pre-K to 3rd grade, except for the case of violent behavior in 2018. The law also requires training in positive behavior interventions and supports. I am so looking forward to the day Ohio becomes a trauma-informed, healing-centered state like Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Alaska, California, and all these other states that are doing this work. So Ohio has some catching up to do. Let me just finish up by saying education failure is not inevitable. Educators who care about our children, all of them, have the power to change it and to bring justice into our classrooms. And like James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Let's face racial injustice together. I want to thank you very much. And now, former board member Stephanie Dodd.
Thank you, Merle, so much. It is a pleasure to be here with my former colleagues. My name is Stephanie Dodd. Thank you to the Ohio League of Women Voters for hosting us tonight and for hosting this discussion on a very important and consequential topic. Before I start, you're probably wondering what this is. I'm Catholic, it's Ash Wednesday. I got ashes like 12 hours ago, but they're still going strong. So I'm aware it's there, it's distracting me, it may be distracting you as well. So I wanted to talk about the role of policymakers and how that plays into this resolution. So as was said earlier, I was a two-term member of the State Board of Education. I served for 8 years, which was the maximum allowed. I've been replaced by Michelle Newman, who I think is going to be an excellent and outstanding board member. I look forward to watching her grow and watching her leadership. One thing that I realized pretty quickly in my time on the board is that District 9 is likely the most diverse State Board of Education district that we have. My district covers, urban, suburban, and rural. So I represented a portion of Columbus City schools. I represented some of the wealthiest suburban schools in the district, and I represented some of the poorest Appalachian schools in the district as well. I myself, I am born and raised in Southeastern Ohio. I'm a fifth-generation Appalachian. I was a first-generation college student who had to take out Pell loans to be able to get through. It wasn't until I got onto the State Board of Education and really started to dive into this work and understand the needs of students and the needs of teachers that I really fully started to understand the impact of our decision-making and how it really plays into how it impacts what our students learn and how our teachers teach. So I am glad that board member Kohler talked a little bit about her resolution. The first draft was very much focused on equity, and it was really just acknowledging our strategic plan, which I think we are all very proud of. And it was really a collaborative effort to create that strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future. But for me, that resolution was more of a way to pat ourselves on the back for something good that we had done. And it really, it didn't go far enough for me. It really lacked that call to action that we needed. And it lacked what the State Board of Education's role plays in this conversation and in this work. So when that resolution was introduced, anybody who knows me knows that I will not speak on a topic unless I am confident about what I'm speaking on. And this was not a topic that I was comfortable speaking about because it's not something that I fully, even to this day, understand. But I reached out to Merle and I just told her that I wanted to see something more. I wanted to see if she felt the same way, because I certainly didn't want to overstep. And she said, no, this needs to go further. And I said, okay, good. Let's see if we can do that. Our President Kohler, we reached out to her, she reached out to us, and we worked with Linda as well. And really, this was a team effort in putting the language together in a way that we did that was very meaningful and very impactful, in my opinion. So for me, my journey in understanding racism and dismantling it really started about 20 months ago. It was outside of my work on the State Board of Education, but I had gone through a training. It was based on the work of Tima Okun. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. That's how I always pronounce it, so I hope I'm always saying it correctly. But if you look at the website dismantlingracism.org, Tima Okun has some work on there about white supremacy culture. And I had gone through a training in the summer of 2019. And I went into the training and I thought to myself, well, I'm not racist. I'm a very open-minded person. And I walked out of that training realizing that this system in which I live wasn't exactly what I thought it might be. And during that training, I kept thinking back to the State Board of Education. And then I kept thinking about the conversation that we had when we as a board were voting earlier that spring, so the spring of 2019, on adopting and passing our standards around social emotional learning. And that was for me something that we as a board and the Department of Education and stakeholders had worked very long and hard on creating. And suddenly there was pushback to that resolution and to why we would need to pass social emotional learning. And, you know, a lot of conversation about how that belongs in the household, and that was the responsibility of parents, and it wasn't the responsibility of the state of Ohio, the state board, teachers, and others. And thinking back after that training, I realized that a lot of that pushback and a lot of the concerns with why we would adopt something like this, had a lot of components, a lot of these white supremacy culture components, things like paternalism, only one right way, defensiveness, power hoarding. Those are just a few of them that I really saw. And it was really an aha moment for me in seeing that. And it opened my eyes. And I wanted to make sure that as an individual, as a board member, that I was working to better understand white supremacy culture and making sure that I understood my own implicit biases. So that's why for me, this resolution was really important. And I think when you look at the first lines of this resolution, President Kohler read the first part about how the state board condemns white supremacy culture, hate speech, those sorts of things. But the very next thing that we say in this resolution is that further resolved, the starting point of our work in racial equity must be reflection and internal examination, whereby the board will look for ways to engage our members in open and courageous conversation on racism and inequity. And then we further go on to say that we will offer training for board members so we can identify our own implicit biases, and that we will require training for state employees and contractors through the Department of Education, which was mentioned earlier. I thought this was really important that we include this because it's sometimes very easy for lawmakers or policymakers or others in positions of power to tell others what they should do. But I thought it was really important, as did my colleagues, that we led by example, that we ensured that we weren't just going to tell teachers and local board members or the state superintendent of public instruction what to do, but that we were going to do it ourselves, that we were going to commit to at least providing the opportunity for all board members to better understand this work and to better understand how it has impacted their learning, their decision-making, et cetera. So I thought the component for individual growth was extremely important. And I think that as policymakers, I think that we certainly have to make decisions and have a good understanding of what our constituents want and need. But I don't think that without understanding how we go about having conversations and making decisions, we can't be completely effective at doing that without understanding our own implicit biases and without understanding how and where white supremacy culture exists. So I think one of the neatest things that we found in having these conversations and in developing this revised draft of this resolution was that the Department of Education, under the leadership of Superintendent DeMaria, this work was already beginning. He was already looking into this. He was already hosting things internally that we didn't know about because he found this to be so important to do internally at the department. We learned about other things that were happening at the state government level, requirements that were being put in place. And so while we were the first body to adopt this resolution, there were already certainly things that were in motion that really complemented what we were doing and the work that we were hoping to do moving forward. So I know for me, an important component of this resolution was certainly making sure that we were raising the awareness and that we were inspiring other leaders to improve themselves, to continue educating themselves, to understand this work, and to make sure that anybody who's in a position of decision making, that they were able to see a path forward in truly bettering themselves and improving their decision making processes. So with that, I think I am turning it back over to Susie, or am I turning it back over to Laura? I'm not sure.
Susie, I know we're really tight. I'm sorry, I said, Susie, I know we're really very tight on time here. So what I really wanted to do was talk about the call to action. And I really think that as far as what the call to action for the State Board of Education and the Department of Education have really been addressed by my colleagues here. And they're also directly included in the body of the resolution itself. I will tell you those.
Can't hear you, Laura.
Gosh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, what I was saying is that my colleagues did a great job, I believe, in really telling you what the State Board of Education considers to be our call to action, and also that's something about the call to action for the Department of Education. Those are specifically called out in the resolution itself. I wanted to share very quickly with you that the board has been working with the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University and with Ohio's Department of Administrative Services to provide hour-long trainings as a part of our regular board meetings. And those to date have been primarily focused on implicit bias, what it is, how to recognize it, what to do about it. We're also organizing small group opportunities for board members to come together around a specific topic because we believe that those conversations would be more comfortable outside of a large televised setting. So we are working on that. And then I want to give another shout out to our superintendent, Paulo DeMaria, who has embraced this work every bit as strongly as any members of the board. He includes in his weekly letter to board members a little box at the end of each of his letters that is his equity corner, where he is providing board members with links to videos or recommended readings or books and other materials that we might want to take a look at. And the other thing that Superintendent DeMaria has done is that he is now, in his report to the board at each of our monthly board meetings, he's going to invite a local school district to come and share how this work is actually being done in their district. And our hope is that we can share all of these conversations with superintendents and others and provide a resource of kind of best practices that we're seeing here. So our invitation tonight is really to you. We specifically ask local districts, and we can flip to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. We specifically ask local districts to do their own internal reckoning and to look at their own practices. And you can see that specific language also in the resolution. But what can those of us who are parents and community leaders and residents do to further this work? This is not something that the board has talked about. And I want you to think back to what I said before about how we are a local control state and we are not in the business of dictating to school districts how this work must proceed. We don't have the statutory authority to do that. But as a parent, as a teacher, as a person who cares about these issues, look at the list of items on the screen here. And there are questions that you could ask. Do you have a strategic plan for your district? And is there an equity component to it? Are there specific benchmarks and accountability measures? And keep looking down through the list, which I will not read to you because I know that time is so short. But as my colleagues said as well, this work is going to take all of us together. Read everything you can, listen to everyone you can listen to, and don't be afraid to advocate for what you know is truth and right. And at that, I'll thank everyone and turn it back over to Susie.
Wow. Thank you all for such a heartfelt presentation, authentic commitment to a very big and difficult goal. And this is exactly what it takes to move anything forward. And I think that the united voice is how you get the power to keep it moving. So I think we're all really grateful both for your presentations and for taking on this issue and for being honest about how hard it is. We have just a few minutes. We had expected to stop at 8:30, but I'd like to just ask you a couple of questions from the audience. And one is from a school board member who is anxious to know what the state school board is doing to get this message to the local level, to local school districts, because this person had not really heard of it. And yet a lot of the work you want to have going in parallel to the work you're doing at the state board level. Would anyone like to speak to that?
President Kohler, why don't you take that one?
I'd be happy to. Absolutely. Well, our meetings are televised on the Ohio channel. And if you have any interest, you can go back and take a look at our July 2020 school board meeting, and you can actually watch the debate that went into this. We are hoping that more opportunities like the one that was presented to us this evening will come along so that we can get the word out about things. We are happy to talk to members of the press, to local school districts, and each of us are, pre-COVID at least, each of us were out and about in districts across the state. And it's, I guess, really our best means of communication is through people like yourselves who care about this issue.
So there wasn't a specific mandate sent to local superintendents and board leaders?
No, there's not a specific mandate sent to superintendents and boards. What we did was we recommended in the strongest language we possibly could that, that local districts take on this work.
Okay. Did the Cincinnati school district implement their own policies for anti-racism and equity because of Resolution 20? Are you aware of that at all?
I think you would have to ask the Cincinnati folks. I really don't know what their motivation. I would like to think that that's why it happened, but I don't really know. Anybody else know for sure if Cincinnati got the idea from us? Okay. But I'm glad that they're doing the work.
Okay.
If I might just add, I don't know about Cincinnati, but I've heard other school districts have taken that resolution and patterned their own local resolution after it. And so I do know that it has had, a ripple effect through the state, but I can't, specifically say who has done that. But
okay. This is an interesting question because you are really focusing where you have control, which is the state board. But the question is, in addition to the resolution, what are your plans to help the children at the home setting and outside of school, which is also a source of some of the where these issues affect people's lives.
Is it okay if I answer that one?
Yeah.
Okay, or at least I'll start. So I think that as a board and through the department, I think there are a number of things that we've done over the years. Certainly this isn't the only thing to address, some of those numbers that President Kohler shared earlier, but it is a component for sure. And it's an important component. But we've done a lot of other things. I mentioned the social emotional learning standards. That's a way to address, student needs. Yeah, not just in the classroom setting. And then Merle talked, and Merle, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about this, talked about the whole child framework. And so I think those are also important components that have an impact on why the data looks the way it does.
And I think each of us has a responsibility. I was reading in some of the chats where a number of people are already aware of the importance of trauma-informed strategies. And we all have a responsibility to do to help children be safe. And with the COVID and the remote learning, all children are going to be experiencing trauma just because of the sudden change in the way they were used to doing things. And adults too, adults are experiencing trauma. So we just have to read, Dr. Bruce Perry is someone who is a guru on the trauma. So if you want to know more about it, he would be a good person to look up. But one of the things in our committee, the Teaching, Leading, and Learning Committee, when we were actually discussing the social and emotional standards, I said that they had to include a section about trauma-informed strategies on the website with the social and emotional standards in order for me to vote to support the social and emotional standards. And so that was done, and I voted to support them. But I think each of us has to hold ourselves accountable and hold everybody else accountable to make sure we're doing what's going to help our children.
Yeah. So what did you most try to accomplish by passing a resolution? What did you think the effect would be?
I'll start. I mean, I'll tell you, we are working on what we're calling one goal for the state of Ohio, and that is a year after Ohio students graduate from high school, we have a goal that 100% of them will either be involved in some kind of post-secondary education, serving in the military, succeeding at a job that provides a living wage, or succeeding in a self-sustaining vocation. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that our children are graduating with the skills they're going to need in order to be successful. So for me, it's a matter of what do we have to do to help every single child succeed. And we know we have a group of children who are not succeeding at the same rates as their peers. And so for me, it's calling that out, is here's the data. Here's what we know is going on. Here's what we've done in the past. This is what's worked. This is what hasn't worked. But we have got to come together and coalesce, and it's going to vary from community to community, around a way that we can provide the resources, the environment, the quality staff, the strong administrative support, so that each and every child in Ohio can succeed. That's the bottom line for me.
One of the pieces of data that I didn't share, I just want to say this real quick, Susie. One of the pieces of data that I didn't share, but I want to share it now, it said Black and Latino students make up 38% of those enrolled at schools that offer AP courses, but less than a third of students taking AP courses. We each have a responsibility, as Laura said, to call it out. Go to your individual school districts and question them. You know, how many African-American teachers do you have on staff? How many African-American students do you have in AP courses? You know, talk to your guidance counselors. Are your guidance counselors saying you're not Princeton material, or are your guidance counselors encouraging students to do what they feel that they would want to do, whether it's military or college or whatever? But each of us has a responsibility to hold ourselves and others accountable to make sure that our Black students and all of our students are able to do what they need to do to be successful. And the last thing I want to say, all of those things I mentioned, the culturally responsive teaching, the trauma-informed, it's a way to get students to enjoy school. If they enjoy being there, they'll come and they'll do well if they know their teachers care about them.
Last word from Linda.
If I could just say, the most important piece to me was that call to action. You know, to me, as I look back over American history, I think really it's 2021 and we're still having this conversation. And it's just baffling to me that, you know, the Civil War was, you know, 1865. And then, you know, we've been doing this for a couple hundred years. And so if our resolution just stated the data without a call to action, it would have no teeth. It would have no accountability. And I hope that this resolution has this accountability piece that will keep the movement towards finding and rooting out this white supremacy culture. That's what I hope more than anything, is that finally, if the traction sticks and we make a better community for all of us.
Let's end on that note. I just, as the moderator, I'm going to put in a plug for House Bill 1, which is the Fair School Funding Plan. And to me, the cornerstone of equal opportunity in this state has to do with adequate and fair distribution of public resources. And we've got to get that one right, because at this point, school districts are just unequally resourced to doing a job. And generally those districts that have the hardest job to do have the fewest resources to do it with it. So I'm looking forward to all your help with this, and we'll give all of our attention as we can to support the intentions of your resolution. So thanks everybody. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. This is really a wonderful evening. We appreciate you. I think we'll call it off.
Thanks again for the opportunity. This has been wonderful.
You're inspiring to us.